All right, so this particular slide just shows a few different graphs here that have displaying kind of the historic progression of poverty throughout the United States. So this top graph right here is showing the number in millions of people that have lived in poverty every year from 1959 to 2017. And this bottom graph here is showing the rate, so the percentage of people in the United States that have lived in poverty every year, again, since 1959. All right, so a few important things to point out. You'll notice that there's a really sharp decline in the actual number of people as well as the actual rate of people living in poverty in the US starting early in the 1960s here. And this is just evidence that this welfare system of enacting or creating the poverty line and then providing federal funding or federal aid for people who are living below the poverty line actually was a productive strategy to reduce the number of people living in poverty when it was first introduced in the 1960s. So at that time, it was actually a really helpful measure. But as you can see, starting around the mid-1970s here, the number of people living in poverty slowly started to climb. And then since 1970, it's kind of followed the same upward trajectory. You can see there's some rises, some peaks, and some valleys here in this trajectory. But overall, what we're seeing, if this pattern continues, is that the number of people living in poverty is likely going to continue to climb something like this, if you're following my cursor here, unless we make some changes. Now, this might not make a lot of sense why the actual number of people living in poverty continues to increase when the actual rate of poverty, the percentage of people in the United States living in poverty, has remained right around this 12% margin since the 1970s. Well, that's because our actual population itself has continued to grow since the 1960s. In 1960, so back here, US population was somewhere around 170 million people. Today, we're sitting at about 330 million people. So that means that if we keep the rate of poverty the same, the number of people in poverty is still going to climb because the number of people we have in the United States is continuing to grow as well. So if we really want to reduce the actual number of people that we have living in poverty, we need to reduce the rate of poverty. And we have been unsuccessful at that since the 1970s. And again, the reason that we have been unsuccessful at reducing the actual rate of poverty and therefore the actual number of people in poverty is because we haven't recalculated how we calculate poverty. We're still using that same measure of 1/3 of the annual food budget, or what it costs people to pay for food in the year, the food budget, and multiplying that times 3. And again, that's not an accurate measure of what poverty looks like in the United States today because cost of living has increased. Virtually every necessary expense that an American has to pay has increased since 1960s. So it doesn't really make any sense that we're not increasing our poverty line or recalculating how we're figuring out what that poverty line measure should be. So poverty rates have remained relatively stable for the past 50 years, but the number of people in poverty continues to climb because our population continues to climb. Approximately 12% of U.S. citizens currently live in poverty, so that equals about 40 million people living in poverty in the United States today, right? Obviously making a huge social problem because it's affecting that million people directly, but as we talked about earlier, poverty is also a social problem that affects everyone because it's not just negatively impacting people living in poverty. People who are living above the poverty line are faced with paying for a lot of these expenses that people living in poverty can't afford. So it really is in everyone's best interest in our society to create some policies to reconstruct social structures in our society that enable everyone to live above the poverty line instead of just funneling into these systems to help people get out of poverty and really doing the bare minimum just to help people get by. We should really be striving to make sure everyone can actually achieve income equality. To more equally distribute the wealth throughout the United States instead of having so many people living in poverty, living very poor, while we have a small percentage of people that are making just an extraordinary amount of wealth and income that doesn't really justify this income inequality that we have in the US. So about 1/3 of the people in the US population, so more than 100 million people, have incomes that are no higher than twice the poverty line, right? So remember, for a single person, the poverty line is just shy of $13,000. So that means that about 100,000 people in the US are making less than double the poverty line, right? And making less than twice the poverty line, so in this case for a single person, making less than $26,000 a year, qualifies you as as a low income resident of the United States, right? So think about that. People making twice as much as the poverty line, still low income adults having a hard time getting by just paying for the basic necessities, right? It's really important to wrap our minds around. One of the other videos I asked you to watch this week was an interview conducted with Matthew Desmond, who is a professor of sociology from Harvard. And a few years ago, actually, he did a really interesting study on poor people living in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, the reason I'm so familiar with Dr. Desmond's work is because I lived in Milwaukee for several years. That's where I completed my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And the whole point of Dr. Desmond's research was to really understand how people living in poverty face this really gross disparity in terms of being able to actually afford something as simple as the cost of living there. And he wrote a book that's titled Evicted, and his research is really just about how these poor people living in Milwaukee, which is one of the most racially and socioeconomically segregated cities in the United States, how these poor people can survive or try to even survive when they are constantly facing this kind of upward battle, trying to make enough money to pay their rent, even though they're being exploited and extorted. And one of the most powerful quotes, I think, from this brief interview was when Dr. Desmond said, "Eviction isn't necessarily the result of some irresponsibility. It's more inevitable." Right? So a lot of people think if you get evicted, it's because you're not working hard enough, you're not paying your bills on time, so you get kicked out. But what Dr. Desmond found in his research is that a lot of these people living in these poor neighborhoods, in this instance in Milwaukee, but certainly in cities around the United States, when you are poor, landlords often recognize the clientele that they're paying, right? There is a very high degree of segregation, meaning that people in cities live in certain neighborhoods depending on their socioeconomic status. And we're going to take a closer look at how this maps out onto a particular city in coming weeks here. So poor people tend to live around other poor people because the cost of living tends to be clustered in neighborhoods, and richer people tend to live around other richer people, right? The cost of living is higher in those places. But even in places that have concentrated populations of people living in poverty, landlords there often recognize that, and they exploit the people living in those neighborhoods by charging them as much as they possibly can that they think that they can get paid, knowing that if they can't foot the bill that they're asking, they can just kick them out and find someone else to take their place anyway. And so what Desmond found in his research was that evicting people wasn't necessarily a result of someone being irresponsible. It was actually kind of this perpetuating cycle furthering poverty and inequality, right? People would rent out an apartment, right? Or they would work really hard to try and pay all their bills, but landlords know that they could continue increasing the rent as they wanted because they were in charge. They had the power to do that. And if they increased the rent to a point where they had a tenant that couldn't pay the bill, they'd get kicked out of that apartment. So it wasn't necessarily that people were getting kicked out of these low-income housing units because they were poor or because they were lazy, because they weren't working hard. It was simply because they were being taken advantage of by a structural flaw in the housing industry in the United States. So Desmond continued to say eviction isn't just a condition of poverty, it's also a cause of it, which makes things worse. All right. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at who are poor. So I'm going to go through a number of statistics here. I'm going to kind of breeze through them because all this content was covered in the reading for this week. One thing I will note is that the reading from our online textbook is getting a bit dated. The data is about 10 years old, so I might have adjusted some of these statistics with more contemporary measures. But by and large, the trends have remained fairly consistent over the past 10 years. If anything, they've actually gotten worse or exacerbated based off these demographics that I'm going to share with you. So let's talk about race. Who is poor in the U.S. in terms of race? Well, most people think that the majority of poor people in the United States are people of color. Actually, that's false. The majority of people who are living in poverty in the United States actually are white. Now, how could this be? Well, let's take a look at this particular graph here. And again, this is from 2010, so a little dated, but these numbers are fairly consistent with today. So this graph suggests that 42% of people living in poverty in the United States today are white. So the majority of poor people in the United States today are white, right? About 29% of the people living in poverty identify as Latino, about 23% is African American, and about 4% is Asian, all right? However, race does play a significant role in predicting who is poor, and people of color are more likely to be poor than white people, right? So this is an important note to really pay close attention to the statistics when you're reading them. The majority of poor people in the United States are white, but people of color are more likely to be poor based off of the number of poor people, based off the number of people that occupy these different racial categories. All right, so that's kind of confusing, but let's take a look at this here. So only about 10% of people who identify as white are poor in the United States. However, over 25% of African Americans and over 25% of Latinos in the United States are living in poverty, right? So the reason why the majority of people that live in the United States that are poor are white is because the majority of people in the United States are white. But only 1 out of 10 white people will live in poverty at any given time, in comparison to about 1 out of 4 African Americans and 1 out of 4 Latinos, okay? So it's just important to understand how these statistics are being communicated and in what context they're being represented, okay? The bottom takeaway is that people of color are more likely to live in poverty in comparison to white people, okay? In terms of gender, we know that women are disproportionately affected by social class inequality. Women and girls are more likely to live in poverty than men. Women are poorer than men in all racial and ethnic groups. The high rate of female poverty around the world is a phenomenon that's referred to the feminization of poverty. So around the world, women are more likely than men to live in poverty. This is not a social trend that is unique to the United States. This is common in virtually every country around the world. And we'll talk more about this when we specifically focus on gender in a few weeks here. Age is also an important factor that plays a significant role in predicting whether or not one person will be poor. 22% of children under the age of 18 are currently living in poverty in the United States. So about 1 in 5 children in the United States are living in poverty at any given time. And this is significantly affected by the racial background of children. So again, if you remember last week, we talked about how it's difficult to really address any one social problem in a vacuum because social inequalities are interconnected with one another, right? So it's important that we approach our understanding of social problems through this intersectional lens. And a great example is by looking at the rates of children living in poverty by racial categories. So almost 40% of African American children and about 35% of Latino children are poor. Right, so significantly impacted by this intersection of race here is the variable of age. Nearly 40% of children will live in poverty for at least a year before turning 18. So that's really significant. Almost half of all children will live in poverty for at least 1 year before the age of 18. And again, that really just shows you how much of a social problem poverty is in the United States. Children living in families with low incomes with incomes below twice the official poverty level are called low-income families. Like I said, 44% of U.S. children, 44% of U.S. children live in low-income families. That's nearly 33 million children in the United States living in low-income families, so families that make less than twice the poverty line. Another interesting fact about poverty in terms of children is that the U.S. has the highest rate of children living in poverty out of all wealthy democracies. We have the highest rate of children living in poverty out of any wealthy nation in the world, right? So we have 1.5 times higher poverty rate for children than Canada, and over 9 times higher than countries in Western Europe. So again, a really clear indicator that the United States is doing something wrong when other industrialized nations have far fewer children living in poverty in comparison to us. Being elderly is also a significant predictor of whether or not you live in poverty. Almost 10% of people over the age of 65 are poor. In total, 36% of all poor people in the U.S. are children, and 8% of the poor are 65 years of age or older. Family structure also plays an important role. Poverty rates are much higher in families with one adult rather than two. 32% of families headed by just a woman live in poverty in comparison to 60% of families headed by just a man and 6% of families headed by a married couple.